It's interesting you brought up Marx. I thought Marx was like an uncle or something, because my father was always talking about Marx being religion is the opium of the people, like little lines like that he would drop.
This is Max Rameau, strategist, theorist, author, and organizer with Pan-African Community Action, and you are listening to The Next World, a podcast about building movements. Once a month on this show, we will explore and celebrate the work of poor people's movements, particularly in the U.S. We will highlight innovative and powerful organizing campaigns and community building led by women, LGBTQ folks, Black communities, and other people of color that are pushing the boundaries and have the potential to transform this society. In this episode, we have a special two-parter focusing on Haiti and all of the turmoil and organizing that is going on there. Our guest today is Mamyrah Prosper, who is the International Coordinator for Community Movement Builders out of Atlanta, Georgia, and Assistant Professor of Global and International Studies at University of California, Irvine. Mamyrah joined us from her home in Haiti, where she lives part-time as well as part-time in the U.S. So Mamyrah, thank you for coming and welcome.
Thank you for having me, Max.
So let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You were born in Haiti or just raised there? You're living in the States now, but what's the...
Yes, the quick bio. I'm born and raised in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, in the capital. Families from the southeast, Jovenel, and which is considered the cultural capital of the country as far as arts production. And I left Haiti at 15, so 1998. This is under the first term of René Préval, who's the successor of Jean-Bertrand Aristide. And, it had to do with several reasons, one of which was to obviously increase opportunity by integrating into the U.S. American system so that I could go to college eventually. And I joined my sister and her family. My siblings are almost 20 years my senior. My father was a political prisoner under Duvaliers. So he went in under the father, Francois, came out under the son. He was there for about 6 years and 7 months. I'm actually learning more about his activities these days because there's been research done by a young scholar who is also the daughter of an ex-prisoner. And more information is coming out about his activities, which, he never wanted to speak on. Part of it has to do with wanting to protect me because I went to school often with children of people who were pro-Duvalier, and he thought it was safer for me not to know.
Right. So you wouldn't accidentally say something that they would report back to their parents.
Pretty much. And, when you're in school in Haiti, the history books end at 1957. Basically, Duvalier gets elected and then you don't know what the hell happens anymore, right? Am I allowed to curse occasionally?
It depends what the curse is. Yes.
It depends. Okay.
Yeah.
I will refrain. And so...
you can let it fly here.
And so, this is something we would talk about in class informally, but there were no books to really guide us through a conversation. A lot of it has to do with the fact that many of these people were still alive, children, grandchildren, and there's a silence on that period. In
so
Haiti.
Marx talks about the end of history being the end of classes, being communism. In Haiti, the end of history was the election of...
François Duvalier. Yeah, and it's the book's done. It's like, it has nothing to say for 30 years. And we never had a reconciliation process in Haiti that, even when Jean-Claude Duvalier was returned after 25 years by Michel Martelly, who was the imposed president in Haiti in 2011.
And Jean-Claude, of course, is baby doc, and he was in exile. Right. He had to flee in the middle of the night in the 80s.
Exactly.
And then, and no one thought he would ever go back. And then suddenly,
pretty much
gets elected into office, and he welcomes Duvalier.
Exactly. Back. He welcomes him back. And I actually went to his trial. And of course, he never showed. He never got tried until he died. I mean, he came back pretty frail, and people were like, "Oh, but he's frail now. Let's just, forget it." It's like, let's not forget it.
Yeah.
He never showed up to be tried. I thought that was going to be an exciting moment in Haitian history. I was there on the ground, like, yes, finally justice. We'll start somewhere.
I've had parking tickets where they had hearings where you're not have to show up, but I don't think like crimes against humanity. I didn't realize that was one of those options you can show up or not show up. I think this is also an interesting parallel to some of the stuff we're going to talk about with the current president Moïse. I remember when Duvalier came back, and of course that's where my family is from as well. I was born there, although I was not raised in Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when Duvaliers came back, it was a shocking moment.
Yeah.
I just remember my family, standing around the TV with their mouth agape, just shocked at the sight. And also, some of the younger ones were like, this guy's a peepaw. He's someone's granddaddy.
Right.
He's frail, and they didn't live through, of course, our generation didn't live through his reign of terror. And there was some, I guess in that respect, there was a rehabilitation. It was like, this could be our uncle. This could be our grandparent. Is this what we want to do to our elderly uncle and grandparent? And there was no real reckoning with the person is responsible for many deaths, many tortures, and many violations of human rights, as well as
and stealing money. And
stealing all kinds
running
of money,
away with it,
poverty.
right?
Yeah.
And I think, to your point, this is what we're seeing in the aftermath of Jovenel Moïse's assassination, that he's being rehabilitated as some kind, people are comparing him to Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the father of the nation who had a dream to develop Haiti. And everything about his what he actually did is being erased, right? And manipulated.
Right.
And so it's the same thing that we saw when Duvaliers came back.
So let's talk about that in a second. But back to you. So your father was a political prisoner, and you were raised with some aura of secrecy around that, and also some sense that your family life could be disrupted because of the
right. So, well, I mean, it's interesting to say that you brought up Marx. I thought Marx was like an uncle or something, because my father was always talking about Marx. Religion is the opium of the people, like little lines like that he would drop. I mean, I was 11, right? You don't really know what he's talking about, but there was always a sense of we all have a role to play in ensuring justice. And so I grew up with that. Even though
I think it's also important to say that in Haiti, people were very familiar with and talking, maybe not openly in some cases, but we're talking about and studying radical political theory, Marx in particular.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
This is not just a place where people are just struggling to survive.
Absolutely.
And thinking about how can I, making demands that are only around the next meal.
Right.
There are organizers who are thinking about what is an alternative way of organizing the economy, of organizing the social structure, and working towards that, and sometimes paying a serious price for it.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that my father says, he didn't necessarily go in as a communist. He definitely went into prison as someone who was fighting dictatorship, because at that time, it's not sort of the dictatorship today that looks like democracy, right, where you're allowed to have freedom of press, even though you get shot afterwards for it, right? But you got to say what you got to say. There were no unions allowed to exist. Community-based organizations were heavily policed, right? So he's growing up, or he's young at that time. He has very young children. And so he's fighting a dictatorship. But he's always described his radicalization taking place while he's in prison, when he's meeting people who are diehard Marxists. And this is part of his awakening to other elements that maybe he felt he had ignored. So he comes from very humble beginnings himself, and had always considered the class question very seriously. I think he, at least from what he said, that this is the period that radicalized him the most.
And this would have been the 1970s or so, where
71 to 76, 78 to 76.
So when he went into prison and then ultimately came out. So your father going to prison, he is a political prisoner. It has some impact on your home life.
Yes.
It must have been very difficult on your mother.
Yes.
So obviously you then growing up make a decision not to go anywhere near politics, certainly not the politics of Haiti.
Well, yes, my mother, became a single parent. She was fired from her job. Their bank accounts were seized. So she had to move in with some of her relatives, and at some point my father's relatives. There's tensions in the family, of course, because people who had the last name Prosper, because my father and two of his cousins also had been in prison. So some of the family was like, okay, we have to distance ourselves from these three so they don't start picking us off, right? So essentially, eventually she tried to hang on, and eventually she went into exile in New York, Brooklyn. So my siblings then left Haiti. They were very young, and they moved to New York. And my father came out actually on December 24th, 1976. So, my father was an atheist, but Christmas was always a very somber day for us in my house because it was a sad day, but it was a happy one too, right? This is the day he came out of prison. And I recently saw the announcement from a newspaper clip that someone shared with me with his name as a list of prisoners who were freed that day. So, all the stories now are really, like, wow, this is real. I mean, obviously I believed he was in prison, but, seeing his name written had an impact. So this is part of, my, I think a lot of Haitian people's stories, right? How we become split families, and there's a group of us who a portion of us who end up living elsewhere, and then folks who stay in Haiti. So my mother had traveled. She was working in a factory somewhere in Brooklyn, and she gets this call, and he, has been freed, but he has no family, really, rejecting the family that didn't choose to stand up to the dictatorship. And so she returns to Haiti, and I'm born almost 7 years later. So I know nothing of the actual experience of living under that dictatorship.
Right.
Yeah.
But you didn't know about the experience of living under the dictatorship. But obviously, if your father was talking about Marx and you knew the stories, at least somewhat growing up, even if you didn't know the details, it's something that went along with you.
In school, though, the books end at 1957. We did have informal conversations about the Duvaliers. And I remember a specific conversation. I'm 11 years old, and people are, I went to a Catholic school. So the nun who's running the class that day, who's brave enough to bring up the conversation, is asking us what we think, what we know. And I say, this is somebody who tortured, murdered tens of thousands of people. And then someone else, clearly the daughter of a Duvalier supporter, says, but he built roads, right? And so just this idea that development is reduced to building roads that lead to whatever site of extraction to a port, right, is considered a sign of development. But, disappearing 30,000 people, that's just a consequence of
it's just
development.
a price to pay for advancement.
Exactly.
For joining civilization. Yeah.
Right. And so, Duvalier is known for saying in 1969 that he wants to make Haiti the Taiwan of the Caribbean, right? What they're thinking about in the 60s, and, this is really the beginning of the neoliberal turn in Haiti, is to turn Haiti into, several industrial parks. So if you go back in time, you'll see that the first decrees that are being taken, or there are several decrees that are being taken in the late 60s, early 70s to create industrial parks to produce garments for, us in the global north, right? And that's still the logic of this particular party, is to take perfectly good agricultural lands that should be producing food for local consumption and turn them into, if not plantations, monocultural crops towards export, but also garment parks to produce clothes for Gap, Old Navy, Zara, etc. And that's continuing the logic of the Duvalier.
Yeah. And continues on today. This is Haiti continues to be a major producer or assembler, I think is what they call it, assembly for the Gap and Levi's and several other things.
Yeah, assembly.
I want to make a observation here. I've asked you several times about your own upbringing and your childhood, and you continue to switch back to Haiti. So I wonder if maybe we should bring in a therapist.
Yes. No.
Your avoidance of.
I will stay on topic about myself.
I just think it's interesting that you find your own story intertwined well with Haiti's.
Yes.
And you're making these reference points here. But just to wrap, so you then, after moving back to Haiti, you then moved back to the States to go to high school or to go to college?
Yeah, so I leave at 15. So I go to New Jersey, Mendham, New Jersey, which is white, upper class neighborhood. So extreme. I mean, I was already, a privileged person in Haiti. I grew up middle class, went to one of the best private schools, all girls, Catholic private school. So there's a continuity in terms of recognizing and, comfort, etc. But obviously the US has a whole nother version of what privilege means. Right. So I joined my sister and her husband, and they're Black excellence type of people, right?
Right.
Ascending to upper middle class status. And I spent 3 years there. At that point, I think, and it's going to be ironic, I think this is when my Pan-African consciousness is starting to emerge more clearly, because I get asked every question about every type of Black person on this planet, right? I'm supposed to know about Nigerians. I'm supposed to know about, Colombians. I'm supposed to defend Haitians. And of course, I'm like, I got to read up on these people, I got to know what's going on. Like, because these white people are outrageous with what they're saying about, my people at large. So, that provokes me into a different kind of, from being Haitian to African, right?
And you embrace that. You didn't run away from it. You didn't say, these aren't me.
No, I embraced it. And it was a challenge for me to expand my knowledge of the African world. I think my father always had a Pan-African perspective, but it didn't necessarily mean that he knew about basic African history or even what had happened in the US, right? It was just sort of a discourse. So I had to fill in the blank with, a little more knowledge.
Right. And then you went to college.
Yes, and then
Northeast.
I went to college, Barnard College in New York City, all women's college by choice. I think, I saw the benefits of being in all women's space. I didn't mention this part of what my father experiences in his radicalization in prison. I was also deep thinking about some gender stuff, right? Because he comes out and he's like Mr. Feminist, right? And he's raising me with that perspective. Because I remember, getting pushback from Haitian friends. Oh, you went to the States and you became this feminist. And I was like, actually, like I was already this way at 11. Because my father was always saying, this is, the future is woman. He's like, men have had, millennia to try out things. And he's like, they just fuck it up.
Wow. Well, that's really interesting that he was radicalized on the feminist side in prison, where usually stereotypically it's thought of that the opposite happens, is even if you become radicalized politically, it becomes ultra nationalist and, another direction.
Yeah. And I remember him saying, even I'm very young, I'm 6 and 7, and he's teaching me how to shake somebody's hand. And he's like, you got to shake it hard and you got to look them in the eye so they know a person is standing in front of them. He's like, you got to learn to drink your liquor. He's like, because wherever men gather, they will be drinking. You're not
supposed to teach children that till they're 10, let me just say.
Till they're 10, right? Not 6.
Yeah.
And so he's like, you have to learn how to drink because, wherever men gather, they will drink and, they won't want you in the space and you have to force yourself into the space. Things like that I remember very vividly today. And I'm like, wow, he was imprinting this very early on. Yeah. So I went to an all-women's college, Barnard, in New York City for 4 years. And actually, he died my senior year after he had finally agreed to allow me to record him and all his stories that he had been holding back. And he dies a month before we have this big date, So I never got the stories. Yeah. I'm very excited about this colleague who's doing the research. So at least, through what she's...
A series of political prisoners?
Yeah, she's been looking at, different archives that some prisoners have kept and even looking at some government documents. She's interviewed hundreds of people who are survivors. And she's also told me some of the people I need to go look up if I want to know my father's particular story. Yeah. So at least that.
Yeah. So you may be doing some research in that area.
Yes.
And so speaking of research, you are now a professor. Where were you to begin with?
Okay, that's a long, I've been out of, like I say, PhD school since 2015. So this is my first tenure track position, but I've been
at University of California, Irvine.
Yes, I haven't even moved there yet. I'm in transit. But before that, I was in Africana Studies Department at Davidson College, which is in North Carolina. Before that, I was doing a postdoc at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. And I was embedded in 2 different centers, so the Institute for Research on the African Diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean, but also with the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. So with folks like Ruthie Wilson Gilmore and David Harvey. So, we could talk a little bit more about that in terms of how my research gets much more deeply political, because I'm an anthropologist. Studying culture means you have to study politics to understand, right, why people do what they do, or, and that there's a dialectical relationship, right, between the two. And actually, I decided to focus my research on Haiti after the earthquake in 2010. At that point, I was in a PhD program, and it was sociology and anthropology at Florida International University, your alma mater, Max. And yes, I was an organizer with Take Back the Land,
which is where you and I met.
Yes.
Now we're getting to the highlight of your entire.
It's exactly like the whole reason for the show.
Yeah.
Just to connect the stories. My father died senior year. I graduate and I'm sort of lost. And I'm like, I'm gonna go back home to Haiti. And instead, for many personal reasons, I end up in Miami. So I was always like, I hate Miami. It seems like a shallow place, like nothing's happening there. And I got this job as like a youth coordinator for some little nonprofit thing. And I remember for Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I'm on a bus with the students. I brought them to the march and I'm passing down, Northwest 62nd Street. And I see the sign, Take Back the Land. And I'm like, I don't know what that is, but like, I like it, Like, I was just like, they're taking back the land. And in my mind, there is a garden, right? They're growing food, because I'm like, this is a food desert. This place has, no real food. And so this is what I think of what it is, right? Mm-hmm. And I had been doing this master's in conflict analysis and resolution that your mother-in-law too was doing. And I was brought in.
Dr. Margaret Armand.
Yes. And yes. I was doing this research project that was talking about Haitian American identity. And then you, Max, are one of the people that they interviewed, and you're talking about yourself as a Haitian American. And then so one of the researchers says, "You don't know Max Rameau?" And I was just like, "No."
This was before we met.
This was before we met. You don't know this story?
I've never heard this story. I've never heard this story.
So I see the sign, Take Back the Land.
So I'm learning as much from this podcast as everyone listening.
So I'm on this research. They mention you, or I'm hearing the interview, and then they say, "You don't know Max Rameau?" I was like, "I don't know." They're like, "Take Back the Land," and I'm like, "That sounds familiar." So of course I Google it, and then I find some information, and I email you, Max, if you remember. And I'm like, "Hi, I'm Mamyrah Prosper," blah, 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 blah. And then you respond. You're like, "What's your political?" ideology, whatever question you ask. And I'm like, okay.
That sounds terrible.
I was like, I'm a womanist, a Marxist, the labeling that you present. And then you invited me to a presentation you were having. I forget where we were, but it was like downtown Miami. And then, I showed up because I had been at some work thing with like, some, I don't know, button down shirt. I even had like, heels on. This is when I was still doing that whole feminine thing. And then we go to the village, right? Umoja Village at Liberty City. And there's, I'm going to pronounce, this is when my Haitian accents and the mulch, right? Is all over I can barely walk in it. And I was like, all right, I am not dressed for this event here. And I'm amazed, right? I'm looking at a shanty town in the middle of Miami, United States of America, right? And so I pretty much at that point was trying to unionize within my nonprofit. We get locked out. I'm jobless. And then Max is like, we have lots of work to do. And I was just like, sign me up. And I remember getting rid of all of my shoes. I was like, I don't need these things anymore. My whole life is changing.
I cannot believe I've never heard this before.
Yes. And I remember, just always being frustrated talking about inequality in the States, inequality in Haiti. And one of my sisters like, you're just always talking about it. Like, when are you going to do something about it? Right. And so this Take Back the Land moment is just the perfect moment. I was just like, this is it. My whole life became Take Back the Land. And
that also brought you full circle back to the political organizing that your father was doing.
Yes. Yes. And and when the earthquake happens, I'm in graduate school at FIU thinking about doing maybe what they call an autoethnography. So it's when you center the story around yourself, but it's a way to get into the politics, right? Sort of what you kept saying I was doing. I'm talking about myself, but I go back to, what's happening in the country. And the earthquake happens. And I remember you, Max, were one of the first people who's like, oh, if you're going to go connect to Haiti, don't connect to these crazy NGOs. You should connect to some of these groups that your partner, Bernadette, was connected to. So in this case, the Haitian Platform for Advocacy for an Alternative Development. And so immediately I contact them and I begin a relationship with PAPTA. And that's my entry to Haitian political life. Because, I was 15 when I left. Haiti for me was a place I would come to visit family and friends. So this, Take Back the Land is a very important period of my life, right? I'm not saying just because you're here, Max, but just in terms of putting to action some of the ideas.
Also, to be fair, you changed Take Back the Land as well. So it was not a one-way relationship.
Oh, that's sweet.
I wasn't saying that to be sweet. Yes.
So all these things are connected, right? Like Take Back the Land experience and work with the groups in Haiti. So there's this continuity really in the work. And in 2010, I become way more involved with Haitian social movements up until today. Mm-hmm.
So that's an amazing story. But let's shift now a little bit, shift gears a little bit, although I don't think it's that big of a shift, at least in my mind, to what happened recently in Haiti with the assassination of the sitting president, although, there's some reasons to think. So let's do a quick chronology here of the time. So I want to spend a little time on what happened here with the Haitian president, Jovenel Moïse. So in October 2015, there was an election in Haiti to elect the president, and the election was completely marred by fraud. So much so that the following year, the results of the election were thrown out. But the election happened in October 2015, and then just like in the United States, the elections are in November, and then the president is seated in January. In Haiti, the elections were in October, and the president was supposed to be seated in February of 2016. So the constitutional term actually began in February 2016, but no one was seated at that point because of the fraud that happened in October. And so the actual election that would be a legitimate election did not occur until November 2016. And that one, Moïse won. There was certainly less fraud. I won't say there was no fraud, but there was less fraud there. And in February 2017, Moïse was installed as president. So by most people's counting, the term of that presidency actually began in February 2016, which meant February 2021 was the end of the 5-year term of president. And yet, Moïse was assassinated in July of 2021, and he was still in the place of a president. So he had overstayed his constitutional term by most people's countings, although by the people who seem like they're able to make the decisions, the United States, Canada, the United Nations, he was still recognized as president. So let's talk a little bit about just the run up to the assassination. It seems to me that Moïse was wildly unpopular 2021, in the first half of 2021, where he had opposition from, of course, the masses, because he was not putting together programs that would alleviate poverty. And he also had opposition from business leaders on all sides and middle class people from all sides. So can we talk a little bit about how in let's say early to mid 2021, what Moïse was like and what his popularity was like inside of Haiti?
If I could just go back to the timeline that you drew for us about the elections. In October 2015, there's this election with very low voter turnout, estimated at 26%. I have this timeline in front of me. I've worked on it.
Yes.
So no candidate receives a majority of votes, right? And there's also because of international observers, local observers are all saying, there's been a lot of fraud. There were already all kinds of, incidents of violence and intimidation, etc. Right? So people reject it. Of course, people tend to reduce the rejection to the political opposition, right? But the people who show up on the streets are showing up because they want their voices to be counted, right? They're not being manipulated by politicians who often people are like, oh, they're being paid, as if they're themselves not able to see that they're experiencing hardship, right? And that they should have something to demand. So what happens is because there's this major rejection of the elections, the OAS, the core group, and Michel Martelly actually single-handedly decide to pick Jocelyn Privé, and it doesn't matter, who he is, right? But it doesn't even actually follow what the Constitution prescribes. In the absence of a sitting president, right? There's supposed to be someone that you pick from the Senate. But instead, they pick someone else that is a compromise candidate, and that there's an interim government that holds the space for a year in the interest of organizing new elections. And these new elections that happens right after a major hurricane, when folks were like, we can't really hold elections to be fair, because even in the Department of South, like 71% of the voting centers were unstable. So how are you having free and fair elections when there are actual voting centers that don't exist, right? So that means people can't register their votes. And even with all of that, you're going to see that 40% of the votes came to be untraceable, what people called eventually the zombie votes. So literally there were votes being cast by dead people. Right.
And maybe this is the fraud Donald Trump's been talking about.
Perhaps.
Yes. Wow.
And so this is, very significant, because now you're going to see, and in the numbers that increase supposedly that would make Jovenel, who had been in third place in this first election that were rejected, he's overwhelmingly number one. Right. And the votes have come, the increase of votes came out specifically from the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area, which we will find out later are heavily controlled by gangs, right?
And the exit polls at this time are even though Moïse wins in the count, the exit polls are stating that Moïse got something like 6% of the vote. So this was like, it's not even like he had 45% and they just wanted to put him over the 50%.
Right.
So he doesn't have to go to the runoff. He went from 6% to over 50%.
Yes.
At least to go to the exit poll.
Yes. So, and so people are already clear, right, that he was rejected. The elections were rejected, 2015. People are rejecting also the 2016 outcome. And, I think what you said was clear about why people think that, in order to continue to keep the calendar going and being on time, that whoever would have won the 2015 would have to cede power in 2021, right? That was the argument by the opposition that the people echoed, right? But as soon as he gets in power, because people already know that he's just there, or at least they hope, they think he's just there as a puppet to replace Michel Martelly, because the Constitution says no president can have 2 consecutive terms. So people essentially understand Jovenel Moïse as a placeholder. And you can see that even during his campaign, how much Martelly is the one at the forefront and asking him to come up and, speak. And you can, Moïse seems like a very shy person at the time, right? Which is a very big contrast to when by August 2020, he's saying, after God, there is no one more powerful than him in Haiti. He's not the same person at all, right? So he definitely grows brave, I would say. And maybe I shouldn't use the word brave to qualify him, right? But bold, let's say. Yeah. And from the beginning, he's being blocked, right, by the opposition and by the people in Haiti, and especially in terms of folks
because they don't think he's legitimate. They're not blocking him.
They don't think he's legitimate.
Bizarre political partisanship. It's actually because they don't think he's legitimate.
They don't think he's legitimate. They know he's not legitimate. Even his claims of, much like Trump, right? He's an outsider politically, and he's a business person who's successful, and that's what qualifies him to run the country. But the business he's claiming as, the experience that he has is one that started just a few years before, when the same party, Michel Martelly, who's in power, essentially gives him land in the north of the country to set up a banana plantation, and also gives tens of millions of dollars from the state to subsidize this plantation. And what we will see eventually when the Court of Audits is able to produce a report, an investigative report on the way that the Petro-Caribe funds were used, and we can get into what the Petro-Caribe is, Moïse will appear sometimes as an agronomist, sometimes as an engineer, in order to justify more monies coming to him. So people are aware that he's a fraud, right? Not only because they stole the elections, but also because even how he presents himself is fake. Right? He's not who he says he is.
Yeah. That was part 1 of our conversation with Mamyrah Prosper. We'll be back with part 2 next week. Thank you for listening to The Next World. I'm Max Rameau. You can find out more about my work at pacapower.org. That's pacapower.org. You can read more about the sponsors of this show on the Partners for Dignity and Rights website, dignityandrights.org. Until then, please tell your friends about us and help us spread the word about this podcast. Goodbye for now, and remember, organize, organize, organize.